So thank you all so much for coming this evening. My name is Tia Bly, this is my colleague Rosie Norman, and we're here as part of the MA Curating St Mary le Strand and Strand Aldwych exhibition group. We're very much looking forward to tonight's discussion. We have a really fantastic panel of speakers with us, and we can't wait to hear what they are going to share with us throughout the evening. So before we do get to the exciting part, I have the great task of some housekeeping and a little overview just of what's going to be happening this evening. So the event is being recorded as we speak, so please bear this in mind when firstly asking any questions in the Q&A or naming any names, whether these are good or bad, as these will likely end up in the event's recordings. There is one wheelchair accessible bathroom on this floor and another one on the first floor, and additionally there is one single bathroom on this entire floor, not to worry anyone. So please venture upstairs or downstairs if you do want to use the loo and it is looking a little bit busy. There is no scheduled fire drill, therefore if you do hear the alarm, please calmly evacuate through the exit stairwell to my right. The meeting point is the garden directly in front of the fire exit. And if you have any mobility issues and cannot descend the stairwell during the evacuation, please ensure you let the evacuating personnel know and stay safe in the stairwell, in the landing, behind the fire doors. But to end on a bit more positive note, we are holding a drinks reception after this. It's going to be just down the corridor in the Research Forum seminar room, so we look forward to seeing you there after our panel. We are going to give you a brief introduction to our project and the reason that we are conducting this forum, and then each of our lovely speakers is going to give a short presentation around our central themes and how they relate to their previous projects, practice and interests. This panel has been brought together as an extension of our current exhibition, Searching for Lost Rain, in which we are exhibiting two works by the artist Gala Porras-Kim, which are Precipitation for an Arid Landscape and Mediating with the Rain in St Mary le Strand Church.
As an interdisciplinary artist, Gala Porras-Kim frames her research around questions relating to institutional practices of conservation, acquisition, and deaccession. Porras-Kim's career explores different ways of engaging with and reanimating artefacts, which have been displaced by the forces and histories of colonialism. Her practice often focuses on the power of ecology and the connection of the artefacts to the natural world. Her research endeavours to extend beyond questions of physical care towards how we care for the spiritual and ritual dimensions of artefacts. Both works emerge from Porras-Kim's research into artefacts removed from the sacred cenote, a natural sinkhole filled with water at Chichen Itza in Mexico's Yucatan Peninsula. These were deposited as ritual offerings to the rain god Shak and were submerged for centuries until the early 1900s, when they were dredged to the surface, later entering the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology in Massachusetts. Precipitation for an Arid Landscape, which is currently on display in the church, is a sculpture made from copal resin combined with dust gathered from the Peabody Museum storage. Copal is native to the trees of the Yucatan Peninsula and is burned as incense in Maya religious ceremonies. Its deep spiritual symbolism reminds us of the sacred homes of these artifacts. The sculpture invites visitors to pour rainwater onto its surface, the importance of which is outlined in Porras-Kim's second work, Mediating with the Rain. This work is a letter to the Peabody Museum, and it outlines the significance of the reintroduction of rainwater to the sculpture. Porras-Kim explains that their owner, the rain, is still around. So central to these two works is how rain acts to symbolically return the traces of objects to the sacred cenote. So bring it back to tonight's panel, we will discuss how exhibitions and display practices can successfully exhibit these objects across various sites while maintaining agency and sacredness.
And just before we introduce our panel to you, we do have a couple of little installation shots of the exhibition, just for those of you who haven't yet visited. So here we have Mediating with the Rain, which is the letter, and then we have the sculpture just to the left there. So to introduce our fantastic panel to you, first of all, and this is in order of which they're going to be presenting, we have Lotte Johnson, who's currently a curator at the Barbican. Her recent projects include a wonderful retrospective of Beatrice Gonzalez's work earlier this year, which we were both lucky enough to visit. A 2024 exhibition, Unravel, The Power and Politics of Textiles in Art, and Carolee Schneeman, Body Politics in 2022, alongside recent commissions by artists including, but definitely not limited to, Citra Sasnita, Toyin Ojiotutula, and Ito Barada. Working from a feminist perspective, Lotte's work often focuses on interdisciplinary practices and transcultural dialogues, and she previously worked at the Museum of Modern Art in New York.
Our second speaker is Natalia Valencia Arango, who is a Colombian curator based here in London. Her current projects include an upcoming Gala Porras-Kim exhibition at the Museum of Modern Art in Medellin, and Vision Nocturna, which showcases the work of Pablo Vargas Lugo at the Fundación Marso in Madrid. She has served as associate curator for Estancia Femza Casa Barragán, as well as editor of Terremoto magazine in Mexico City, and as Southwest State of Mind in Athens. She was on the advisory committee for the 2022 Sydney Biennale and was nominated for ICI's Curatorial Vision Award in New York.
And of course, last but not least, we have Jen Ellis with us, who's an international curator whose practice investigates intersections of contemporary art with a focus on themes of time, ecology, and heritage through the lens of global artistic dialogue. Having curated over 100 projects globally, Jen founded Aspire Studios in 2021, a curatorial studio and project space in London, facilitating artistic experimentation and exchange. Jen is also the artistic director of Terra, which is a monumental, site-responsive exhibition across historic sites around the UNESCO Heritage Vineyards of Burgundy.
So, without further ado, please join us in welcoming our first speaker tonight.
Thank you so much, Tia and Rosie, and thank you to the whole MA curating team for putting on this event and this exhibition, which I experienced on Friday, and I really encourage you to go and see it and pour some water on the sculpture and be part of this kind of new ritual that Gala Porras-Kim has created. I'm just going to find the clip on my slide. So yeah, it's wonderful to be in dialogue with Gala Porras-Kim's rich and generative practice, but also the inspiring curatorial work of Jen and Natalia. So I look forward to talking with you later. And in my presentation, I'm going to draw on my own curatorial experience and touch upon a few projects that I've created with some artists who respond to histories of specific ritual objects in their own practices, but also conceive their own works as forms of ritual offerings in themselves, often acting as interventions into institutional contexts in which I work. So rather than addressing the lives of the artefacts themselves, I'm going to consider how the lives of the artefacts are sustained and transformed in artistic, poetic imaginations and practices, which I think is deeply connected to how Porras-Kim works and how she has poetically approached the objects from the sacred cenote in this exhibition. But primarily I'm going to speak quite in depth about Chitra Sazmita's recent exhibition Into Internal Land at the Barbican, which I curated in 2025, in which many of the works reinterpreted specific Indonesian ritual traditions. And in fact, Sazmita conceived the whole installation at the Barbican as a ritual for the space itself. I'm going to briefly address Cecilia Vicuña's revival of the Andean quipu as an act of ritual and resistance, and I included one of her works as part of the exhibition Unravel I mentioned earlier, which I co-curated at the Barbican a couple of years ago. And we're also going to draw on some connections to the collaborative work of two artists from that exhibition as well, the Netherlands-based artist duo Antonio Jose Guzman and Iva Jankovic, who are both also in the Venice Biennale at the moment. And their textile installations and performances invoke histories of animism, Afrofuturism, and ritual and migration. So I hope through exploring these works, we'll find connections back to Porras-Kim's practice and her investigation and project of reactivating the ritual significance of objects from the sacred cenote. So what we're looking at is the opening of Balinese artist Chitra Sazmita's exhibition Into Eternal Land. And she really considers that art can be an experience of transcendence. She envisaged the commission, as I said, as a journey to sort of navigate one's inner self and set out to create what she describes as a ritual offering to anyone who set foot in this gallery. And ritual really pervades her work in the exhibition from the moment that you step into the space. The frequencies of a composer that she collaborated with, Aga Praditya Yogaswaras, sounds vibrate through your body as you enter the space, and they were intentionally pitched to kind of encourage a meditative space. And this kind of extends to the way that she uses, and I'll talk about this in a moment, sifted ground turmeric in the exhibition in the shape of a golden mandala, which is traditionally used as a kind of spiritual guide. So these inherited practices and histories at the core of her practice are held with alternating reverence and criticality, as I'll explore in a moment. She's really reimagining rituals, not only as an alternative present, but also as an alternative future. So setting the scene, the prologue, the entrance of the show consisted of what Chitra calls a gathering of flying spirits. And these are suspended sculptures composed of cowhide saddles, embellished with natural gemstones, from across the Indonesian archipelago, and pearls from Lombok, and they're slung across these salvaged wooden pillars. And she's really interested in how the traced marks that you see, these lines with the embroidered gems, they trace actually the stretch marks on the cowhide. So thinking about how the body kind of carries the memories of its movements. But what I find particularly interesting in relation to kind of ritualistic practice in these works is that these glittering beads that adorn the cowhides invoke a very specific ritualistic practice in Indonesia of burying precious stones under the foundations of a house to bestow good fortune on its future residents. So here they're no longer buried, but actually brought to the surface. So she's kind of bringing this history of ritual into the present. In what she called Act 1, a panorama of Kamasan scroll paintings unfolded through the space. And these are 8-meter-long canvases, which reveals epic visions of women undergoing processes of transformation. She takes this very specific tradition of Kamasan painting as her starting point, which dates from the 15th century in the village of Kamasan near the mountains of Gunung Agung. And this tradition is dominated by male artists who would pass their knowledge down from father to son. And it would determine how they made and created compositions based on shadow puppets, tales focused on Hindu epics and Indonesian mythologies, including the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. And the male characters were inevitably the protagonists, and women were consistently sexualized in this historic tradition of the painting. So Sasmita, as you might be able to see, and I'll just show you in nice detail, transforms these narratives. But really importantly, these paintings historically were used to adorn temples and palaces and homes, and they were used as literal didactic tools, direct references during ritual ceremonies. So she's interested in honouring this tradition, but bringing it into the present and questioning these reductive, colonial and patriarchal attitudes embedded in the works, but also in colonial attitudes towards traditional Indonesian art. So there's this multi-layered project going on, because Kamasan paintings historically were treated and viewed as decorative. They were seen as these sort of ethnographic artefacts by Dutch colonizers, and they've continued to be commodified and treated as souvenirs for tourists. So Sasmita is interested in acknowledging this history of painting as the art history of Indonesia, but also preserving and reinventing this ritualistic practice of painting through her interventions. In Act 2, which we'll come to in a moment, 2 monumental circular shrines, as she called them, defined the space. And these were composed of black and white braids of artificial hair that streamed down from the ceiling, referencing the DNA held in our bodies, in our hair, inherited from and shared with our ancestors. And they specifically invoke this sort of matrilineal connection across generations that Chitra is invested in. And each circle of braids enshrines a painting on python skin at their center. And Indonesian culture, snakes are prevalent, and in her work as well, and they proliferate across the Kamasan paintings of Act 1 that we just looked at. And they often form this Ouroboros, or infinity symbol, of the snake eating its tail, this sort of ritual, this eternal cycle of life, death, and rebirth. And snakes in Balinese and Indonesian culture are a symbol of divine inner strength. And the snake, or naga, symbolizes the concept of kundalini for Chitra, and she kind of extends this into her work. And the idea of kundalini derives from the ancient Sanskrit teachings in Hindu culture, which is a form of feminine energy that resides coiled at the base of your spine and then extends upwards towards your head chakra. And so she believes this energy is also connected to a very small gland called the hypothalamus, which is in your brain, that secretes hormones that regulate the vital rituals of the nervous system itself in our bodies: sleep, hunger, your mood. So she's directly kind of invoking that history in these works. And at the top of each of the paintings was a carved mask depicting Rangda, a demon goddess who is an incarnation of the Balinese witch, Kalon Arang, and another god, Boma, who protects against evil and acts as a guardian to the underworld. So she's kind of directly invoking these spirits in the work. So she also made these incredible collaborative textiles. I will just skip through them because I'm aware of time, and I want to end with this extraordinary space, which was the prologue, as Chicha called it, this ritual offering of a space centered around a mandala, a composition, as I said, used for spiritual guidance. And this circle was actually composed of brown turmeric, which symbolizes the warmth of the sun and acts as the focal point as a space for meditation. And Sasmita really intended this as a space that any visitor could come and meditate in or use as a space of reflection. And indeed, many of our visitors did that, which was really beautiful to see. And inscribed in this deep yellow surface is a 14th century poem called Kidung Wagasari, which calls to Mother Earth and celebrates the forthcoming abundant season of harvest. So she really envisaged this closing chapter as a space for reflection on the preceding journey that you had experienced. And her work, I think, honours the regenerative forces of nature. She reflects this as a direct quote. When we perform rituals, we do so with the intention of praying for the protection of nature. We deeply believe that harming nature can lead to suffering for future generations. So she's really drawing on these many centuries held belief systems that she has grown up connected to in the Indonesian archipelago. So through reinventing inherited narratives and rituals, Sasmita proposes this very multi-layered cosmology in which women, through their own reclaimed rituals, subvert expectations and reclaim power and find their own deep-rooted genealogies in the lives and the work of their ancestors. So as a kind of counterpoint to this, I'm going to bring in a couple of artists who engage with rituals and sacred objects in very different ways. They were both included, as I said, in the exhibition Unravel, the power and politics of textiles in art. And the first artist is Cecilia Vicuña, a Chilean artist who engages, in this case, and in many of her works, with the poetic revival of the quipu as an act of resistance. So she takes inspiration from this ancient Andean practice of knotting, called the quipu, which was seen both as a functional form to communicate information, but also a ritualistic practice that connected its makers to the cosmos. And for this particular installation, Quipu Astral, which she made in 2012 for the Sydney Biennial, lengths of knotted, unspun wool stream down from the ceiling, as you can see, and they're actually accompanied by sounds of Vicuña chanting poems related to water, because thread is a metaphor for water in Andean culture. This is a really monumental work, as you can see from the scale of the person standing next to it and in these photographs. And she describes this work as a poem in space, which embodies her deep engagement with this ancient Andean form of the quipu, this system of writing with knots, but also this kind of cosmological practice. And I think it's important to know that in 1583, following the Spanish conquest, quipus were banned and ordered to be destroyed. So it was this act of kind of colonial violence that suppressed the quipu, and Vicuña wants to revive this practice as an act of poetic resistance, and in her own words, as a way to remember its potential involving the body and the cosmos at once, she says. And she proposes this work as a sort of prayer, in her own words, for the union of the world. So she found in this context, so this work was made in Sydney, in Australia, she found these very poetic resonances with the ancient indigenous peoples of South America, and also those ancient Aboriginal people in Australia, connecting their worldviews of exchange, equality, and freedom. And in particular, she was thinking about the oral traditions of the Andean concept of the cosmographic seque, I hope I'm pronouncing that word right, meaning line, and a very different but connected practice called the Aboriginal Dreamtime songlines, as these sort of metaphysical maps, as she sees them, that honour the life-giving forces of earth, water, and song. So she's finding these kind of transcultural connections between rituals in her own practice. So I'm just going to end by talking about a very different work, which was in the same exhibition, and actually in the same section of the exhibition titled Ancestral Threads. This is a work by the Netherlands-based artist duo Antonio Jose Guzman and Iva Jankovic, who stage installations and performances incorporating textiles which invoke histories of animism, Afrofuturism, migration, and transcultural exchange. And this work, Messengers of the Sun, is part of their ongoing Electric Dove Station series, which delves into the very complex history of indigo as an ancient and sacred material. Enslaved people who were taken from the African continent brought their expertise of cultivating indigo to the USA, And Guzman and Yankovic are very interested in questioning and challenging this history and kind of confronting it. In particular because, and this was kind of came out of conversations with them, that indigo became so popular that in the 1700s, the profits generated eclipsed the revenue from cotton and sugar. So it kind of became this incredibly valuable traded material. And this deep blue dyed indigo became an actual currency, and one length of cloth at points was traded for one human body. So it has this incredibly violent history embedded in its history of exchange and trade. So Guzman and Yankovic make textiles dyed with indigo, and they block print them with calligraphic patterns and designs inspired by everything from DNA sequences to scriptures inspired by grigri, which are small talismans or amulets originating in West African Islamic traditions, for example, used by the Fulani people to offer spiritual protection. And these amulets were actually banned by European colonizers. So again, this kind of suppressed ritual history that they're bringing back in their own sign systems in their work. And the intricate block printing technique they use is also a centuries-old practice called ajrak, which is rooted in Pakistan and India and passed down orally, only orally through generations. So it's kind of a practice that is, passed down through practice and through kind of description. And they think about ajrak as this, in their own words, rigorous visual language with cosmological resonances, a way to hold pattern, memory, and time, which I think is something also embedded in the idea of ritual. So they tear these strips of indigo, printed and dyed fabric, and piece them back together with Japanese borrowed stitches. And the title of this installation, Messengers of the Sun, refers to this Afrofuturist myth in which the lost children of the prophet Sun Ra symbolize ancestral migration from sub-Saharan Africa to the Sirius B galaxy, and they are understood as the messengers of the sun themselves. Guzman and Yankovic also activate and kind of reanimate their works through performance, which further draw on this mythic reference of Sun Ra. And they combine music from traditions like electronic, dub, punk, and various African drumming traditions, as well as their own ritual chanting and dance and procession. You can see an install shot of a performance at the Venice Biennale in 2024 here. And the work is often really rooted and grounded in histories of structural injustice, grounded in Panama, which is where Guzman is from. So their work kind of radiates outwards to bring in this patchwork of references, paying homage to many ancestral and ritual knowledge systems. So although these artists draw on specific ritual objects as references, and they often employ the materialities of the sacred, they actually use them as their jumping off points to create porous works that ask us to confront histories of extraction and suppression of these traditions and the dispossession of the people who are connected to them. So I think this connects in a kind of expanded way to Porras-Kim in many ways, who reimagines and reanimates the sacred objects from the sacred cenote in her work and calls into question their removal and displacement. But also with the very dust that in some ways suppresses their existence in storage, she offers them this new life and reconnects them with the life-giving force of water, which I think connects also to artists like Cecilia Vicuña. So it's this act of kind of poetic and political resistance that I think resonates across all of these artists' work. I'm going to end.
Hello, thank you for having me in this wonderful panel with these wonderful colleagues and to talk about Gala. I am myself at the moment working on the first solo exhibition of Gala in Colombia that we opened in September at Medellin, at the Museum of Modern Art Medellin called El MAM. And Gala is Colombian as well, and it's her first solo show in the country. So I am very involved with Gala's work. So I am gonna basically talk about her in relation to writing and research by Candice Hopkins, and this is a bit more like I guess like theoretical elaboration of how I read Gala's practice as institutional critique and how that relates to the sacred and how objects, artifacts, cultural belongings change meaning, not through their relation to the institution. So I am reading from my phone like millennium. Okay. So I want to begin with a question that has accompanied my research for some time now, and that I find most productively articulated, not in theory, but in the concrete, often disquieting situations that arise when indigenous cultural belongings find themselves housed inside Western collective institutions. The question is, what happens to the epistemological abyss when the institution itself becomes a terrain where this abyss is traversed, rearranged, and perhaps partially healed? So what is this epistemological abyss that I am speaking about? So the abyss is, the abyss that I'm referring to is the one formulated by Portuguese sociologist Boaventura Sousa Santos. And this abyss exists in culture in general. It's not only in the institution, not only in the art museum. So the Sousa Santos argues that Western modernity draws an invisible yet foundational line between that which it legitimates as knowledge, so that is the scientific, hard facts, rational, secular knowledge, and all that is on one side of this abyss, and all that it places on the other side, traditional, indigenous, spiritual, non-hegemonic, non-rational forms of knowledge. So these two sides of the abyss coexist in contentious proximity throughout the colonized world, and their friction is not merely philosophical. Moreover, both forms of knowledge, Western and non-Western, are to be considered incomplete. This is important because the idea of completeness is a binary that doesn't apply, and it's not something we want to work with. So the friction between these two sides is ecological, political, gender, material, and pervades all aspects of society and culture. My research has been tracking the ways in which contemporary practice approaches this abyss, not to resolve it, but to sense it, to make it legible up to a certain point, and to find in its fractures a generative form of healing. So I want to focus on two practices. So first of all, the curatorial and intellectual work of Carcross Tagish First Nation curator Candice Hopkins, from the US nowadays. Candice is currently executive director and chief curator at Forge Project, and has curated numerous exhibitions, Site Santa Fe Biennial, was part of the curatorial team of Documenta, infinity of projects. She's brilliant. And then I will connect this to Gala. So Candice Hopkins, we'll start with the situation she describes in her essay, Outlawed Social Life, which she wrote in 2017 for South magazine, which was the name of the magazine published by Documenta 14, that ran under the artistic direction of Adam Shimshik, and Candice Hopkins was part of the curatorial team, as I said before. So in her essay, Hopkins traces the colonial banning of the potlatch ceremony in Canada between 1885 and 1951. This was a ban that led to the violent seizures of masks, coppers, regalia, and headdresses from the communities. Their subsequent dispersal into the holdings of institutions like the Royal Ontario Museum, the Canadian Museum of Civilization, and then the long, painful process of their partial repatriation to Indigenous-run cultural centers in British Columbia. What interests me most, however, is not only the historical trajectory that Hopkins maps with such precision, but what she observes happening in these repatriation spaces in the process. So I must say that potlatch is a traditional ceremonial feast practiced by Indigenous peoples of the Pacific Northwest coast in what is now Canada. It serves as a vital economic, legislative, and social system in which hosts distribute wealth, food, and gifts to guests to affirm their social status, celebrate milestones, and honor the deceased. So this was already like an alternative economy that doesn't really align with capitalist understanding of property, and so this was already another system of exchange, etc. So it was banned. And then ban ended in 1951, and objects, cultural belongings were repatriated. I have to say also that cultural belongings is also, I first learned about this term also from reading Candice Hopkins' writings, and it's important to say cultural belongings because, as you say, that their belongings, you are literally connecting them to a people, to humans, and then if you don't call them artifacts, then you can also imply that they have a life as well, that they're not mere objects. So, yeah. So, at the Umista Cultural Center in Alert Bay, repatriated, okay, so this is a potlatch ceremony. This is when these belongings were repatriated to this place in Alert Bay. And this is how they are installed nowadays. And this is what is interesting to me for many ways, like museographically, and how like ritual kind of is brought back. It's brought back through museography and through cultural use inside the museum. So repatriated objects are arranged around the edges of a room, ordered roughly according to their role in a potlatch. At the center of the museum is an open area dedicated to dances and ceremonies. The returned objects, as Hopkins writes, oversee the proceedings like sentinels. This is not a metaphor. The institution has been reorganized, spatially, temporally, and somewhat cosmologically, around the living function of the objects it holds. The ceremony does not happen despite the museum. It happens inside it, it activates it, and it somewhat reformats it, kind of like tackling this epistemological abyss. So one can consider that these ceremonies are a form of active maintenance, a way of renewing the energetic and ritual connection between the belongings and their people, of insisting on the objects continuing life beyond their classification as artifacts or patrimony. They constitute a practice that traverses the institution's boundaries without necessarily dismantling them. Because, yeah, the belongings were not returned to private families, houses. It is a native cultural center, but it is alive because people go and do the potlatch there as well. Because also these objects have been through a lot, also kind of like chemically, right? And sometimes it even makes, yeah. This is and that brings me to this quickly. This is a story of, for example, sacred Kogi masks that had been held by the Ethnologisches Museum in Berlin, and then were returned finally in 2023. This is the first this first text is how the Ethnologisches Museum talks about what happened with this return of belongings. They don't mention the fact that these objects are toxic because they've been held for so long that, and to be kept intact, they were infused with what is chemicals and like just a toxicity that it actually does not make sense for them to go back to their communities, right? So let's say that this I find like a practice that is interesting in the middle of that, and this is, I don't know exactly haven't followed exactly what the afterlives of these objects are in Colombia, but this is, yeah, an example. Okay, and then I'm gonna connect to that. So it is from this position, the institution as a site where the epistemological abyss is negotiated and sometimes partially healed, that I want to move to Gala Porras-Kim, whose work I understand is occupying an adjacent but distinctly different place of enunciation. This is important as well, how an artist positions itself within these discussions and within this abyss. So Gala Porras-Kim is not indigenous. She's Colombian, Korean American artist who was born, like me, in 1984 in Bogota, she situates herself explicitly as a cultural observer, a practitioner of institutional critique who works with collecting institutions such as the Fowler Museum in LA, the Peabody Museum of Archaeology and Ethnology in Cambridge, in the US, the Instituto Nacional de Historia y Antropología in Mexico City, and many others, the British Museum in the UK. And she's often drawn to cultural belongings that carry little or no information about their origins, objects that represent gaps in institutional knowledge, openings for historical speculation, and above all, she's interested in the continued presence of a spiritual life that many times the institution is structurally for now, unprepared to acknowledge. Or the interesting thing is that the institution changes and acknowledges and changes the thinking about this life, the sacred life, the material life. So I'm interested in this kind of like flux, no, of constant reflection of how to deal with this. What I find, one of the many things I find significant in Porras-Kim's practice is her awareness regarding her own position in regards to the aforementioned abyss. She's not attempting to speak for the cultures whose objects she researches. She's pointing from her formation as an artist and researcher and within Western intellectual discourse, pointing towards the epistemological contradictions that the institution itself produces and sustains. Her letters to museum directors, for example, one like the one that is at St. Mary's Church at the moment, are not demands. They are invitations to think together about what it would mean to extend institutional care beyond the physical conservation of material form, to include what she calls the dignitary interest in the ritual life that may still exist within an object. So these are images. This is going to, some of this body of research is going in our exhibition in Medellin, but this relates also to the dredged objects that were conserved for hundreds of years because they were submerged in water and now they're dehydrated in the Peabody Museum, and then they are kind of like brought back together in this painting, in this drawing practice as well. Some others, there's a whole story of these objects being taken to the US, then being returned to Mexico, and a long research that she did for the MUAC exhibition she did recently. This is a presentation of that. I think this is also from MUAC. So to bring it back to conclude, both practices share, I think, a commitment to productive and healing opacity as well. It's important, the notion of opacity, and it's a refusal to make everything legible, translatable, digestible within Western curatorial logic. So Gala sends questions to institutions like, how are you dealing with this dehydration, or how are you dealing with the fact that in the British Museum this sarcophagus is not exactly well placed according to how it's supposed to be, but she raises questions. She's not demanding, and then so in that sense she still allows some opacity, because it's important to note that there is a resistance against this modern taxonomical, make everything transparent, make everything logical, make everything readable, that is the modern this modern impulse that we kind of like want to resist in a way. So to bring Candice's research, writing, and Gala's practice into dialogue is for me a way of thinking about the many forms that abysmal negotiation can take place inside the institution, from the ceremony that reorganizes a museum space to the letter that asks a conservation team to reconsider sacred implications of belongings. What they share is not a strategy but an ethics, an insistence that the institution be held accountable to cosmologies it did not produce and cannot fully translate. And how, what is the space within this fluctuation? Is it returning toxic objects, or is it creating a space for the community to still coexist with these objects? I'm just kind of raising questions. So Hopkins and Gala Porras-Kim remind us that opacity can be a form of dignity. This concept of opacity comes from Edouard Glisson's Right to Opacity. That comes from a theory that he developed around the archipelagic forms of culture in the Caribbean that also deal with these ideas of how to relate. Okay, I'm almost done. So opacity can be a form of dignity, and the speculative future is still, most importantly, an area for intellectual and political action. Together, they suggest that the abyss inside the institution is not simply a problem to be solved. It's a site of ongoing, necessary generative friction one that art and curatorial practice are uniquely positioned to sense and to make livable in expansive ways. And just to finish, this morning I was listening to a podcast conversation between Gala and James Webb for the Goethe Institute from some years ago, and James Webb was saying a museum, this is James, not Gala, he was saying a museum is not the afterlife, it's just a chapter in the story.
Hi everyone, good evening. Lovely to see some familiar faces. I won't bore you with my bio, you've already heard it, you can read about it. But I thought that it would be really interesting to maybe set the scene a little bit. I think we've heard from two amazing colleagues. Thank you so much for sharing, and thank you MA Curating for having me here. I come from a different world, maybe not a heavily academic one or an institutional one, one that's more of an independent curator and sort of has responded to certain gaps that I have seen whilst one trying to make an impact. And I think that the way that ritual is going to be coming up through my presentation is through thinking, first and foremost as a curator, you know, that it's meant to come from the verb curar, which is to care, right? So how can I show care to not only various artistic practices, but also site and also context, right? And in so doing, I'll be talking about various projects that I have done predominantly in the UK, but also abroad. I think it helps, though, to go all the way back, I guess a little bit to my background and what's led to this approach. In a past life, I studied law. Maybe some of you have studied other disciplines before arriving to history of art. And the reason why I was really driven by that was that I wanted to make an impact. I realized that I was not a lawyer, so I wanted to study history of art. And the reason why I put that in there is that I went to study at Cambridge. I'm very grateful for the education that I received. But at least when I studied there, they referred to art from East Asia as art from the Far East. It didn't quite sit, and I decided then and there that I wanted to be working within the context of contemporary art with artists who are working then and now. This led me to a journey which eventually led me to living in Hong Kong. I raise this because it's very important. One of the first trips that I did was to the Guangzhou Biennial. The second trip that I did was to the Asia Pacific Triennial. And I went to the APT. I don't know if you know about APT, it's in Brisbane. And I realized I know nothing. I literally know nothing. And it was because I had grown up in this Western art historical context, and I realized that all these theories that I had learned, right, and their theories, right, this over-intellectualizing, somehow did not translate. And so I was like, okay, great, well, this is where my education restarts, right? I'm not going to discard what I've had from beforehand, but maybe there are some new approaches that I need to be learning. Let's approach this from a space of humility. And I was very fortunate to work for the next 7 years with an incredible commercial art gallery called Kiang Malang. And when I joined them, they had Fernand Léger on the artist list, you know, very much not my vibe now. But we slowly started building out a program that built out in concentric circles. And the reason why this is super relevant is that we started thinking or developing a methodology of local to global. I call it a methodology now. At the time, we weren't thinking with those terms. But that led to all kinds of projects, which I will share. And then in 2020, I decided, I've been operating under this framework for a while. Let's become an independent curator. Lo and behold, COVID hits. I'm like, oh my God, what do I do? Do I join a gallery? Do I join an institution? People had shared jobs with me that could have been interesting. And I was like, you know what? Maybe I need to create my own. Maybe I need to sit outside the structures that exist in order to be a sort of non-existing, at the time, bridge. So that has led me to creating this curatorial studio. And now we also have a space, which I consider a lab, where we experiment, we test. Actually, in the context of ritual, I guess, we recently welcomed Unión Textiles Semillas, as well as Alejandra Mizrahi. To be continued.
key ideas. So for me, one of the governing things, and I think this applies incredibly importantly to, what my colleagues have been talking about, but also what Gala's, thinking about, and it's like art, space, and context. I don't feel, at least, that you can take the three things out. So whenever, at least I'm approaching a project, and I think this is incredibly critical when you're dealing with ritual, whether it be in the art itself or in the space that you're entering or even in your approach to it, it's why this, why here, why now? You've got to question it, right? And one of the things that I'm incredibly sensitive to, and I think this could not be even more critical than in the context of thinking about this term ritual, is the UFO effect. So, when I was living in Hong Kong, I saw that there was all these artworks from the West that were being brought over to Hong Kong because, they need to see it for the first time. And it was just being plonked. I was like, cool. Is there any relationship here? Like, what are we trying to tie it in with what's happening? And then also, vice versa, right? Like, there was all these artists and artworks that I had, developed relationships with from living in the Asian Pacific continent for about 5 years. I was like, how do I introduce these artists back to Europe in a way that feels sensitive, engaged, so they're not just landing and then expecting people to understand where they're coming from. And so this is where I tied in that methodology of global artistic dialogue, of trying to think local to global. Maybe there is a site that maybe speaks to the work more so that there's a certain kindness to the audience when they're entering in order to understand it more. And maybe it's actually not sufficient to just be looking within an art historical context. Maybe we should be looking at forms of knowledge exchange. Maybe this is how we can be a little bit more sensitive to context. So collaborating with, anthropologists or a poet or an architect, lots of collaborations with architects. Or currently my mind is in the world of music and collaborating with a composer. So let's, I guess, go all the way back. This is 2019, 2020. These are some of the last two projects I did when I held this directorial position at the gallery. And I moved back to London, and my responsibility was to build, and this is very crucial, east to west dialogue. I didn't want it to be coming out of what was happening in London. I wanted to be bringing artists from the continent over and introducing it thoughtfully, hopefully, within a particular framework. I want to focus just briefly on the work on the left. This is a work by Traumarama. They since had a solo show at the Stedelijk and have shown in all kinds of institutions. This was their first solo show ever in Europe. But I knew their work. They're from Bandung in Indonesia, so back to Indonesia. And this is a really special waterfall called Madakaripura. And Madakaripura is a site of meditation, but also worship. This is 8 meters, if you'll believe it. That was it, hell to install. And it is shooting across 20 meters in this then deconsecrated, and actually now deconsecrated church. And the film would move live time to how many times the weather was looked up on the internet for that particular site. So tying in ritual of meditation with a site that had previously been sacred, while also thinking about contemporary practices, right? We're on our phones. It's just reality. It's the way it goes. And sort of, I guess, the next mega jump since then, became independent, launched Upsara Studio. One of my very dear colleagues and friends is in the audience who actually created this. This was insane. This was with Guatemalan artist Elda Kale. He's of Mayan Kaqchikel descent. Okay, so this is a difficult context. Okay, I was approached to work on this project. This is Freeze. You might recognize the booths. Those gray floors. And Edgar couldn't come over because it was COVID times. And neither could Stefan from Proyectos Ultravioleta. So, it's a lot of responsibility that I took care. And so we had a lot of conversations. We're like, well, what is it? Where do these rocks need to come from? Right? He's like, well, let's not ship them over from Guatemala because this whole work is about giving offerings back to Mother Earth, right? So it doesn't make sense to ship it, right? That's bad for CO2. And so sourced Then it was about the fruit. So a mixture. So I remember distinctly, Sophia is in the audience, developing a relationship with a Brixton, a Brixton fruit seller, and every day we were changing the fruits as you go along. And it became a whole thing. What's interesting also is that there were elements that were definitely ritualistic but not performative. And I think ritual and performance are very, very different things and to bear in mind. So it was very important that a particular type of sacred water was poured over these stones before it was opening to the public. It could not be filmed. That was not the point. But it was something that in order to gain the authenticity of the work, it had to occur. And so since Edgar couldn't come over himself, thank God there was somebody at Delfina Foundation who was of also Mayan Kaqchika descent and could enact this. Why is this a really important project? This then went on to be, and I'm going to say quote unquote, acquired by the Tate. What's even more interesting is because the language did not exist for this type of acquisition, it forced the institution to rethink the language around collecting indigenous practices. So in this particular case, they came up with a new term, which was custodianship. And so now we'll hear more and more that term, assuming custodianship over the work, and custodianship was having it, yes, physically the rocks in their collection over a period of time, but it was more about for X amount of money, bluntly, there's going to be some funds going back into the community, and so the element of ritual giving back to Mother Earth actually is giving back to the community. This is another interesting example. This is where actually the site is one of ritual, right? Now here we're in a Christian church, but versus the other one, this is actually a working and functioning and living church. So this is interesting because I want to step and also talk about the element of curatorial practice where there is that sense of sensitivity to site, where you're not just coming in and placing the artwork and just assuming that it's going to be okay. I spoke to the Reverend once, twice, 3, 4, 5. All this exhibition design was created specifically with the site in mind, so that out of respect, their beliefs are not mine, but that doesn't matter. We're in their place, we're being hosted. The works were moved to one side on a Saturday so that service could take place, and they were moved back on a Monday so that there would be that element of coexistence. This is another important pivotal moment. This is the work of Naminapu Memuruwai. She is an artist from Yirkala. She's in her late 80s. And Yirkala, if you don't know where it is, it's like the northernmost point, nearly northernmost point of Australia. So she's a First Nations Aboriginal artist. I was invited by Freeze to curate a series of projects around the world, each of their fairs, around the theme of time. So I thought it was interesting to respond to this idea of evolutionary change, or different approaches to, I guess, articulating how that changes occurred. In this particular work, Naminapu was an artist who I'd already worked with. So I just want to make that clear. Naminapu was not an artist who I just encountered, by looking at Instagram. I was introduced to her by an incredible First Nations Aboriginal artist and curator called Tony Albert. Him and I had co-curated a show previously. Naminapu was invited by him because she's one of the elders in the community. We connected her work. I then invited her to be a part of this solo commission. At the same time, she had a solo presentation in the Arsenale at the Venice Biennale 2 years ago. So a lot of things coming up at the same time. I guess this is also really relevant as sort of, explaining this bridge or caring connector, for lack of a better term. This work ended up being acquired by the Tate, which is really important because it was one of the first artworks, by an Indigenous First Nation artist from Australia to go into the collection. I should say that Naminapu actually really did not care, which was quite funny. We were all really ecstatic, and she was like, but these are beautiful works made on bark, and the whole story of River Stars, that you're looking at the ancestors, and it follows a particular story of a barge. Then here is another work, another recent project. This is with Lucia Pisani, which I did last year. So clay, seeds, and other ancestors. So I think here it's also interesting to think of how ritual can come into a practice without necessarily being indigenous, right? You know, we've looked at Gakalel, we've looked at Naminapu. And so here is this idea of these different forms that have a humanoidal aspect, but more crucially, it's speaking about migration through the lens of plants, right? So the foil of them. So whether it be, you know, how the piña comes from one part of the world and then is found in another, but then also all the various imprints in clay, clay being one of the most original materials when it comes to creating any types of, you know, artifact, right? So thinking about those approaches. Conscious I've got probably less than 1 minute going past. Terra. Terra is a project which has required extreme sensitivity. I have now been voted in as the artistic director of this project, which I co-founded about 4 years ago. It is on UNESCO heritage protected land, right? So this brings a whole extra series of hurdles, but the reason why it also relates so interestingly back to ritual is that the reason why Burgundy is important is that it all started off with the Cistercian monks, and the Cistercian monks having incorporated in themselves this ritual of making wine. Okay, now we've commodified it, we enjoy it, we drink it, but actually what it all originated of was this process of action, doing and over again, and it is not one, again, I want to say this, of performance. People are very reserved, very, very quiet, and if you come in and then just start planting lots of things and ideas, it will be met with so much prickliness. And so really try to speak with the site. And this is something that I emphasize a lot. It's harmony. How do we create harmony? How do we create dialogue with? So the top left image was the very first year. That was a work with Don Ng, and it is called An Atlas of Us. And it's used through the melting of ice and then its evaporation. And there's this whole cyclicality, right? So the cyclicality also speaks, I guess, to the very act of making that has been going on for over 600 years. Bottom left-hand corner, that work actually ended up being acquired by a museum. And there you see different types of dried flowers. And I'll just leave with maybe the rightmost slide or photograph. That's a pavilion by Dan Graham. We were given this incredible opportunity for the first time ever to install a sculpture in the vines outside the Clos de Vougeot vineyards. This site is the equivalent of Mecca. Like you really have to go in with a lot of delicacy. And we presented various options, and at the end, actually the different winemakers, because it's the local stakeholders, right, as well, loved this work the most because there was a dialogue with and through this architectural space to both have something existing, but also peering in to peer out. It's like, okay, that's interesting. But then also, how to install it? These are all these questions. So we actually had to dig up a little bit of the ground. We had to keep the soil because the soil is very important. And then when we de-installed it, we had to put the soil back in because these are all the things that when that site is one that is protected and the act of the ritual act of engaging with it daily is very, very, very important. It's one that you respect. I'll leave that there. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for those amazing presentations, also diverse in their content as well. I think we have a lot to talk about. We have a couple of our own questions, so would you be happy to join us at the front? And then, yeah, we're going to have a couple of questions to kickstart the discussion, and then if anybody else has any questions, we will open up to the floor as well. So first of all, I have a quick question for Lotte. So based on your work curating exhibitions around ideas of sort of ritual intervention within institutional spaces, how do you think these spaces can be ritually activated, and what do you think this asks of the institution in return, sort of in this dialogue as well? It's a heavy one to start.
So how are these spaces activated?
Yes, in what ways?
Yeah.
It's really interesting to hear, especially to the different senses and these ideas of like sound and smell, if these really sort of emphasise these ritualistic and sort of spiritual dimensions as well.
Yeah, for sure. I think particularly with Chitra Sasmita's exhibition, I thought about this a lot because she actually had this very distinct vision from the moment that she started conceiving this project. So we usually work with artists for between 1 and 2 years for curved commissions at the Barbican. And I think that's something really interesting that you brought up, Jen, about this kind of sustained, engaged relationship with an artist, particularly when they're drawing on very particular kind of sacred or ritualistic practices, that you need time to explore those ideas with the artist to really understand how they want to bring them into the space and in response to the specificity of the site. So yeah, I worked with Chitra for just under 2 years, and from the very beginning she had this very clear vision, and so she knew that she wanted to create this ritual in the space, and she wanted to transform the space, which is transformed every time by an artist, but usually is this kind of immersive exhibition, and of course is very distinct according to the artist's practice, but I don't think has ever been used quite in that way as this kind of offering. And crucially at the end of the space, this space for meditation. So there were many, many discussions, and of course it's not just a dialogue between a curator and an artist, but the production team, the front of house team, how that space is going to be held and how visitors are going to be welcomed, how that work is going to be contextualized and unpacked, and yeah, given context, kind of out of context basically, because she's bringing a very specific practice that is rooted in the Indonesian archipelago, but which is actually incredibly diverse as well. And she's also drawing on both Hindu and Muslim traditions in her work, and she kind of sees this amazing synchronicity and dialogue between those two. But yeah, it was a whole host of undertakings, from thinking about, how do we actually choreograph that space at the end? I'll use that kind of space at the end of the exhibition as an example. Like, how do we create a space that invites people to sit and meditate? And so she didn't originally have that idea of having the cushions around the mandala. Originally it was you were going to stand in that space and be invited to sit on the floor. And actually we wanted to think about also how your body is supported. And traditionally when you meditate, you might kind of sit on this bolster cushion or on the floor just cross-legged, but how we might invite people to do that so that those cushions were a signal. And I think she's also very interested in how many Hindu and Muslim communities are here in London. So she was excited by this possibility that the space would be actually have a lot of relevance to the people living in this incredibly kind of diverse, globally cultural city. And yes, and then there was the kind of practicalities of it, like how do we create a space that has an atmosphere and kind of a sense of respect and reverence. But I think actually for me it was unbelievably simple, because she just did that through the act of generosity of the work, and even things like the lighting, the atmosphere that she wanted to create kind of invited you to sit, the kind of focus spotlight on the mandala, and also the use of turmeric as this kind of sensory activation in the space was very kind of seductive, literally, and in its colour and its scent, but also deeply symbolic. Turmeric is used in many Hindu ritual ceremonies as a symbol of prosperity, but also purity as a kind of cleansing kind of material. And so yeah, all of these associations brought up and kind of needed to be taken into consideration.
Thank you, that's so interesting. I think it's fascinating how all three of you sort of, I think, really highlight this sense of needing to slow down when engaging with these ritual practices, and also the bodily experience of the audience, that embodied response to the works, and how important that is. So that was really interesting to hear about. Just a quick question now for Natalia. So you mentioned how Porras-Kim's work as an artist, she deals with these questions of advocacy for non-Western spiritual practices, but she also makes sure that she's claiming not to speak for other cultures in a paternalistic way. I read this term rematriation used in line with her work, so could you perhaps expand on that idea, and do you think that's a more productive lens, this idea of rematriation, for Gala's work?
I don't have enough information about rematriation. I do know Michelle Shenandoah, who is an indigenous scholar from upstate New York, because I know a friend who works with her, and she has this rematriation.org enterprise, but I don't know the specifics. But yeah, maybe if it's like repatriation as opposed to repatriation, then maybe there are other ways. But I think repatriation still implies an idea of returning.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, sometimes maybe like the idea of returning is dismissed sometimes, or for example, the objects have changed so much that it wouldn't make sense, like with this toxic mass going to Colombia, how's that gonna go? So it's more about like how as I was saying, like how to engage with the flux of reconciling these different views. If it is inside the museum, then it is inside the museum. Like for example, Gala's small work that she managed to do at the British Museum to convince the museum to move a little bit the sarcophagus from Egyptian tomb, and she managed to do it. Or the rehydrating the works, that this is actually put in place. So that is a way, I think, of like kind of like negotiating and living in this liminality in a way that I don't know, is still accessible, and both sides of this abyss are kind of like happy with. I mean, it's always friction, but yeah, it's like how to make coexist all these different understandings of existence and of existence on many planes of existence. In a way.
That's really interesting. So maybe there's something there about the liminality and trying to sort of remain in that space without compromising on those various different tensions.
It's really fascinating sort of learning more about the different relationships, as you say, really complex relationships and understandings between institutions and people within sort of art generally and communities as well, which actually leads me to a question for you, Jen, particularly relating to this idea of custodianship. I find that really interesting as something that sort of has emerged really so recently. I was wondering if you could talk a bit more about how that emerged and how you see the kind of future for these kind of more collaborative and equitable relationships forming in the future.
Yeah, thank you. In the lead up to the assuming of custodianship by the Tate, there were a lot of conversations about how this would take place, right? And so I think that speaks very beautifully to what you were just saying, Natalia, where there is an element of negotiation without losing sight of the core, right? The core is we want this to be supported, right? So not necessarily physically be a part, we want it to be supported. Then the next question was the how. But then because we live in a world where we need words, we need terms, we need categorizations, that led to what word do we use? And I'm seeing this increasingly, right? I mean, you just mentioned that, like maybe we have to create a new word. And this is something that we've been thinking a lot about at the studio. And so when the Tate, and I remember there was a whole committee of 6 people came by to look at the work. The first conversation was, we want to have Edgar Calel be a part of the collection. And then within the space of 5 days, it then shifted to, we're talking to the acquisition committee. And then it shifted again to, but what about this element of caring for it? And then from caring for it, that's where the term custodian came in. The reason why I think custodian is also really interesting is because it implies a limit of time, right? So you're not going to have it forever. And then this is where, even though I never practiced it, this is where my legal background got really nerdy and really excited, because I'm like, well, what are the terms of this custodianship? Pray tell. And it settled on a temporality of 13 years, right? So nothing that's too short, that's just going to be a blip, right? You're speaking about length of time, right? Long term. And then also what form would that take? How would it be dispatched? And I think more fundamentally, and it sent lots of ripples, there's lots of articles about it out there. If you're really curious, you can go and look it up as well. it was just really shifting that museum practice when it came to approaching indigenous practices, which in themselves are not about owning, it's about exchanging with, right? So it's about recognizing and honoring. But it took a while.
Great, thank you so much. So I think now if we move on to any audience questions, either for individual speakers or just generally. We have some microphones, I think, at the back. There's a question down here at the front, was there? Yeah, just. Yeah. Yes.
Yeah, just to continue on the. Oh,
That's fine.
yeah, just to circle back on what we were just talking about regarding custodianship and these new forms or genres, if you will, or terminologies. Just curious about the afterlife of the custodianship, like what happens after the 13 years. So, yeah.
With regards to this work in particular, or in general?
Or in general, or yeah.
That is a very interesting question. So I'll speak to this particular work. This work came in, let's call it 3 parts. The first part is activated installation, right, of the rocks with the fruit. Obviously, you have to keep on replenishing the fruit because if not, they'll be horrible. And it's also part of the gesture, right, of giving back to these various rocks. Those rocks are allowed to continue within the Tate's collection ad infinitum, and I know this because I will share this story because it's too funny. Nobody wanted to deliver them to the Tate, so my husband took a day out of work to deliver them, and then they had to stay to one side for a whole week or so because they had to make sure that the moss was not going to infest the rest of their artworks. Anyway, the Tate can keep the rocks, but they have to keep on changing the fruit. Then they also acquired a drawing, so it's the drawing that you saw in the photo that I shared, and so that's going to stay, ad infinitum with the Tate. But then when it comes to these funds, so the payment, the monetary exchange for this artwork, or let's call it the permission to exhibit and activate, then that's going to last for 13 years. But I think the conditions were quite interesting in that obviously there's an artist fee, but then also there was a particular interest in going to different parts of the community in order to actually help infrastructure, schools. There's a lot of work that has done since, where he's actually involving his family members or covering things with dirt, and it's part of this cyclical creation, or maybe cyclical economy, for lack of a better term. So that's what the custodianship sprung off.
So what is the difference between custodianship and consignment?
So consignment, I would use consignment in a commercial sense, so between 2 galleries, or between.
But museums
do
take
museums
consignment?
You do a loan agreement, no?
Yeah, but consignment is
It's commercial.
permission to sell, right?
Ah, okay, so I'm thinking the wrong term. Okay, but this is, okay, so let me rewind. So this affects the price
No.
of the work. It is meant to be returned. Ah, okay, because, yeah, that's.
And so there was a price for the work, but it's not you're not paying for the rocks, if that makes sense. You're kind of having, let's say, 13-year right to give back X to the community.
Ah, okay.
Yeah.
I think that's so interesting because the idea of boundary time, not only sustained engaged relationship, but then boundary time in which
Boundary time.
in 13 years the relationship between an institution and the artist might have changed, the artist's own lived experience might have transformed, the institution's reputation or actions might have changed, so it gives the artist the kind of agency to renegotiate or to kind of rethink how their work might want to exist within that institutional framework. Is that the idea that at the end there'll be a kind of coming back together to think into the future about the life of the work?
We will see, but I think that what Lotte, you just brought up on, it's sort of this shifting of power dynamics. So who is setting the terms, right? And it's the terms being set from within as opposed to being assigned, and the terms also being adjusted and adapted for the context. So we're coming back to that context game.
Can I just, I was doodling the words as
Mhm.
you were speaking, and of course the credits of this the initiative, sorry, of changing the language and their own expressions about that. However, when you look up the artwork on the webpage, the collection webpage, they have to fit it somehow into vocabulary. So here it says that it is lent by a child.
Yeah,
This
yeah,
sort of
that's what I
speaks
meant,
to what
loan.
you were saying.
Not consigned loan.
So somehow, and I'm sure that this is about someone having to perhaps just check a box on the system
100%.
because of, and doesn't necessarily contradict the custodianship. But I think it reflects the tension that still very much exists in institutional practices.
That's so interesting. It's the closest approximation.
It's the closest approximation, and it's not necessarily a contradiction, but they probably could not use that term.
Yeah.
For that sort of tombstone.
Yeah.
Great, thank you. If there's a question just there at the back.
Hello, good afternoon. Hi, Jen. I have a question. I don't know if it's appropriate in this forum, but I'm a collector. I focus only on Southeast Asian women artists. And I have recently, and I don't know what term to use, acquired is the word, a beautiful work by Maria Madeira, who represented Timor-Leste at the Venice Biennale, not this one, 2 years ago. And to me, it fits into this, this discussion in terms of what the work is trying to do. And I have recently lent it to another institution in Boston. And I was extremely impressed with how they treated the work from when I hand delivered it to them, to how they hung it, to how they invited students to engage with it, the discussions that they had, etc. And now what you're making me think is, within the context of a private collection, how am I going to maintain this, this specialness? It's a work of such poignancy, and every time I look at it, it reminds me of hidden women's histories and how she's helped lifting the veil of this traumatic period in Indonesian and Timor-Lestean contemporary history. But I'm sort of like thinking, gosh, I've got a huge challenge ahead of me in terms of keeping it properly cared for. So I'm thinking now, what have I got myself into? I'm now into collecting as an act of feminist care. And I'd really like you to comment on that, please.
Yeah, I think that's a beautiful question, and yeah, something to be like really grappled with as a collector. I think one sort of immediate thought I had was to be led always by the artists, because if they are drawing on their own very specific kind of ritual and sacred traditions in their own culture, they will have very clear opinions about how the work can be contextualized, what its afterlife is after they've made it, how it lives on through the inner spaces, but also in the hands and care of people who look after it or who acquire it, this word that kind of is very contested that we're speaking about. So I would definitely be led by the artist's kind of desires and vision for the work, and how the work lives on in kind of in their imagination and in reality. And I think maybe a useful example of this is actually going back to Cecilia Vicuña's work with the quipu. Most of the quipus that she makes, when you reenact the quipu, so when you bring it back to life, and she sees it as kind of actually constantly living, but when you kind of bring it back into being in a space, you have to perform a ritual with Cecilia, and that involves all of the people who are constructing the quipu. So we had a whole team of people who were working the unspun wool and preparing it to make that quipu. And before we embarked on that process, unfortunately she couldn't be with us in person, but we had a Zoom ritual with Cecilia, and she led these extraordinary chants and songs over Zoom, and the whole room of all of the technicians and curators who were involved in that project were present. And so I think that's just one specific example of how an artist is really dictating and kind of leading the terms in which that work lives on and its own kind of ritual significance. But but yeah, I'd be curious to hear what the artist thinks, like if you have a dialogue with her about how she feels, that continued life can exist.
I agree so much with what you're saying, Lotte. And I think I would add what you're already doing, Christina, but it's collecting with humility and collecting with agility and collecting and listening. I think that we currently live in a world where practices are changing and understanding that they're constantly evolving things, as opposed to something static and pigeonholed. That means that we have the ability and the agility to also adapt, right? So maybe one way of collecting and presenting at one point of time was appropriate, why here, why now, the now, right? And then maybe it's something to be revisited later, right, in a different way. So I think that's very, I think that humility is really important.
We have a question over here. Should we go here first and then
Thank you. I have a question about the kind of complications of translating some of these works and practices into the spaces in which you exhibit them. I mean, obviously you talk about sacred, deep time, religion, these very sort of deeply personal, ancient sort of practices, and then the display context. I mean, these are regulated spaces, some are commerce, some are production, and I would imagine some of them deeply unprepared for this type of work. So as kind of curators and people who bridge these sort of divides and gaps, I'd love to know some of the kind of the challenges or that you face as people trying to do this work. Yeah, I want the gospel.
I mean, it's a great question, and there are so many frictions that come up when you're thinking about inviting an artist into an institution who's working with, well, any specific history, but particularly with these kind of sacred and ritual practices, whether they are embedded in the work as kind of literal objects, or, as I was talking about, these kind of more like poetic starting points for their practices. I think just going back to a specific example, for me, it was so important that Teacher Says Meter's installation was in the Curve, which is a space that is free to the public. And I don't think I would have chosen in that moment in time to program her for our main gallery space, which is ticketed, and you can have to pay up to £18 for that experience of seeing an exhibition. And I think it was so important that this work that she saw as this offering to the space and offering to the people who visited it was not a commercial space, was not a place of transaction, was a space that anyone could come into and was open all day into the evening, and yet was made as accessible as possible. So yeah, that's kind of one way of navigating it, is finding the right context with the right conditions for the artist.
Thank you so much. I think we have time for a few more questions. So there was a question over here.
My question is slightly related to the previous one, and I hope it isn't too far from Mark. But I was just wondering, something that was touched on during the discussion, which was about having to put the work in quarantine for a few days before it was accepted by the museum. And so I was wondering if there was a lot of difficulty with that. Because, for instance, this museum in Leipzig, which wanted to return Polynesian artifacts to its owners, and these artifacts they couldn't have them if they wanted to. So I was wondering if there were a few issues like that came up and how you would deal with them. And because it's not very much.
If we were talking about the toxic elements that I talked about, that these were, sorry, I didn't specify. Kogi is a nation from Colombia, so they were from the north of Colombia, Sierra Nevada, and they were yeah, I didn't follow exactly what happened when after they were returned, but this element of toxicity, I don't know how. I mean, it would be really interesting to think through with artists about how to maybe, or yeah, ideally a Kogi artist who could, yeah, this could be, yeah, it's more communal decisions on how on what to do with these artifacts. And then in that sense, for example, I can speak about another work that, I don't know if I'm going too far away, but another story of like what, for example, what Lotte was saying is a work of Gala Porras-Kim, who is, that is out of an instance of exploration comes a perennial showing, it's called, and it's kind of very well-known work of hers where she takes spores of mold from the British Museum. She collected the spores, and so she considers, rightfully so, I agree with her, that the collection is contained in the spores, right? And she's also providing a way for the collection to exit the museum by the means of a spore. And every time, so now we're bringing this work to Colombia, for example, and it's an ordeal. Like they got a specific conservator, freelance conservator, just to deal with this, and they're like, "Are you bringing spores to the museum?" And for example, this work was exhibited in Mexico City at WAC, and they extended the exhibition, and so this, okay, so the spores come out, and they are dispersed over a canvas, and then so a kind of sort of abstract living form of the collection takes form in this canvas. So it is a collection, and in another way. So what happened in Mexico City was they extended the exhibition, and the mold was just too happy and extended, and it started becoming just a green kind of like blob. And so they were like, Gala, what do we do now? Do we start over? And now we're having to think about these things because our show is also is getting extended for a month. So how to take care of these things. So yeah, I mean, I think Gala is a great person to tell these kind of stories. But I think it's really interesting that every time, I guess it's creative, or it's like, yeah, that's part of. Gala has fun with this, and me as a curator, I'm having fun also, thinking through with the institution and the artists thinking through these things.
Thank you. I think that's actually a really wonderful anecdote to end on there. So I think to bring the evening to a close, I just want to thank you all for joining us this evening, and we hope you found it as fascinating as we have.
Absolutely, and thank you again, obviously, to our wonderful speakers, and a big thank you to the team that made this possible, Dr. Devika Singh, our amazing programming team at the front here. We've got Dora, India, and Aliyah, and Carlos, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, our wider curatorial team, some of whom were here this evening, and of course the research forum, which is Diego, Leila, and Jem as well, who's joined us this evening. So thank you very much for joining us. Please do join us for some wine.